A special presentation of LLBN with archaeologists Dr. Lawrence Garrity and Dr. Doug Clark. Excavating the Bible.
Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, what archaeology can teach us. This is a program exploring the contributions of Middle Eastern archaeology to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark, Director of the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University in Riverside, California, along with my co-host, Dr. Larry Garrity, also from La Sierra University, also a longtime archaeologist, to help us explore Jerusalem in the time of the Crusades and of Islam. We have invited several guests, Dr. Kent Bramlett from La Sierra and Dr. Bailey Gillespie, also from La Sierra, both of them longtime archaeologists, both of them well acquainted with Jerusalem. So let's talk about archaeology and the Bible and maybe what we can learn. The first slide here, tell us what this is.
Well, we're looking at the traditional site of the crucifixion and burial and resurrection of Jesus. So this is the Church of the Holy Sepulcher. And you can see the large dome. This is actually the rotunda over the tomb, which was identified by Constantine's mother, Queen Helena, as being the actual place of burial of Jesus.
Lots of debate about that.
There is.
Places that maybe in part due to your denomination, maybe dependent on your denomination, whether you would go here or to the Garden Tomb where lots of people go. But in any case, attempting to represent the place of the burial. A bit of historical context. We're talking about a fairly thin slice in this particular program, but Jerusalem has a long history.
Right. We start at the Byzantine period and kind of bracket some of the periods we're going to talk about from 324 to 638 AD. Church of the Holy Sepulcher, of course, was built right away at when that Byzantine period began officially in 335. In 614, the Persians captured Jerusalem, which is not uncommon for Jerusalem. It seemed to be captured by almost everyone who ever went there. In 629, the Byzantine Christians recaptured Jerusalem from the Persians. And then we have kind of the first Muslim period. It's AD 638 to 1099, takes us right up to the Crusade times. And Caliph Omar enters Jerusalem early on, and then in AD 661 to 750, it was ruled under the Umayyad dynasty. And then in 691 on, the Dome of the Rock was built, the mosque there. And then in AD 750 to 974, Jerusalem was ruled under the Abbasid dynasty. Then, of course, you have the Crusader period. They came down there to free the country from what they thought was Islamic rule. Crusaders captured Jerusalem. Saladin captured Jerusalem back in 1187, and the Crusaders recaptured Jerusalem 2 times, in 1229 and in 1244.
You know, rather than giving the impression that Islam and Christianity had these battles back and forth, we have to say that in the earliest period, there was peace between Islam and Christianity. And when Omar came to take over Jerusalem, he was very, very generous to the Christians. He recognized the importance of the Church of the Holy Sepulcher, and it's only later in Crusader times when you really get into these battles between the two groups.
Right. In fact, I think we could even talk about the language we tend to use is the conquest. But if you look at the archaeology of Jerusalem, if you look at the archaeology of Damascus, if you look at the archaeology of several sites in Jordan, churches were being built and maintained long after what we called the conquest. So I think we have to change the language here. There was a lot of collaboration and a lot of living together in relative harmony. Battles, of course, but I think we need to repaint the picture, and archaeology is helping us do that.
It is.
There's an interesting quotation about the kind of destructions that took place there and the kind of the changing of hands that the cities took around it. Great quote, no event during the first millennium was more unexpected, more calamitous, and more consequential for Christianity than the rise of Islam. Within a decade, 3 major cities in the Byzantine Christian Empire, Damascus in 635, Jerusalem in 638, and Alexandria in 641, all were switched hands in terms of the Islamic group taking charge.
And it is these 2 sites in particular, if you add to those other sites in other parts of the southern Levant, that is Syria and Jordan and Israel, that indicate this more peaceful transition. In fact, I was introduced to this in a comprehensive way by an Israeli archaeologist who has set his sights on this transition. That's what he does. That's what his life has been dedicated to. And he says we just can't find these violent, at least the evidence of these violent destructions of cities.
Well, we often hook these dates to particular events, but there's always preceding and post events that took place. The transitions were much more gradual, I think.
There were certainly pivotal battles which tipped the political powers, but life in the cities continued. We know archaeologically churches were built for another 100 years throughout the biblical region, the Holy Land.
So we do have to keep that in mind. Holy Sepulcher again, the holy grave, the holy tomb, Church of the Holy Sepulcher.
Yeah, this actually is the church that would date through much of the Byzantine period.
So we're talking 6th century?
From the time of Justinian in the 500s.
Okay.
On through, really, through the Crusader period.
Yeah.
And we have what they called it the Anastasia, from the Greek word for resurrection. This was directly over the tomb of Christ, as they called it. It had been a cemetery of the 1st century AD, but they had isolated one particular tomb, which they said was the tomb of Christ. This is the area of Golgotha. It was a disused or rejected limestone outcropping, had cracks through it, and it hadn't been quarried along with the rest of the limestone. So that commemorated the place of crucifixion, and then this is the large nave or sanctuary where they held the majority of the services, and an open courtyard. So we had sort of this whole complex that was commemorating, remembering the last events of Jesus' life and his resurrection.
And how much of this structure survives to the modern day? Is it the whole thing?
If you go there now, the modern church, well, it dates back to the 12th century, but it's only this much of it. So this was destroyed in the 1000s and then rebuilt in the Crusader period later, a little bit later, and it really only constituted this much of it. There are traces of this church that one can see from a different axis altogether.
Okay. And this is?
Well, this is the front of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre today. We always think that you're going to have a massive, beautiful front of a church, but this is a really functional place. And it's, in a sense, owned and operated by 6 different denominations, as it were. And that little ladder's got an interesting story there. There was someone who decided to clean the windows early on and moved a ladder there. And a group of the people that owned the church, all the different groups, realized that they had what's called the status quo. We know what that means. You're not supposed to change anything. And so that ladder's been sitting there since the 1800s. And nobody can move it because that's status quo.
Well, it goes along with the stones of the building. They can't be moved either too readily. One of my favorite maps. In fact, maybe one of the earliest maps of what we would now call the Holy Land. Where is this found? What does it tell us?
It's from
Well, it's the town of Madaba, and it's in St. George's Church, and it's a part of a huge mosaic floor that covers most of the Middle East and Egypt and
it goes down to Egypt.
And most of the little places on the map have little boxes that look like buildings, but when they got to Jerusalem, the artists there wanted to make sure they had a very good picture of the Jerusalem as they knew it.
And it probably goes back, what, to the 5th century AD, something like
century.
that?
6th century, early 6th century.
And then it fell into disuse, and a Christian group from down in southern Jordan decided that they would repopulate the region, and they came up and they were going to build a church. And as they were preparing the ground for the church, they ran into this again and rediscovered it, and so incorporated it into the church.
Parts of the map are broken badly, but it was huge. I mean, if you think, what, 70-some feet long,
at least,
something like that, and 15, 20 feet wide.
And there are pictures of the Jordan River with fish in it. And it's quite an interesting map to see.
Well, they're swimming in the Jordan River until they come to the Dead Sea,
then they
turn around.
There's
there's an indicator that isn't a good place to go.
But you can see the Byzantine map there that showed the Madaba map that shows that main cardo, and here's a reconstruction kind of the Byzantine Jerusalem, and you can see the cardo that runs from the end of the city. We're actually looking at this from the other side.
It's turned,
we're
isn't it?
standing on the Mount of Olives looking back at the city where the Temple Mount is. David's city would have been down here. But you see the corridor that runs clear through, Roman corridor over to the Damascus Gate, and the Nia Church, the new church right here on this end, and some of the important parts that were in Byzantine Jerusalem. This is a great little oil lamp. I put it in just because I like lamps. And we have two of them just like it right here on the table. We'll talk about them later, I'm sure. 4th, 5th century Byzantine oil lamps decorated with a stylized tree of life. Sometimes you would find menorahs on some of them, and sometimes they would have writing on them, Pretty Little Lamp or Jesus, the Light of the World. For the Christian period, these lamps were important.
Now, we're moving to something else, something truly Crusader, right?
Yes.
So Crusader, set the time again. We saw it on the early slides.
1099
is the arrival of the first Crusade, right?
This is the back part of the nave of St. Anne's Church, which was a Crusader Church. This is the original part of it. It's been
and if we look at what now has been restored, it would look rather like this.
Probably the most perfectly restored Crusader Church in Christendom. And it has an echo that's just unbelievable. It's got about a 9-second echo. So all the choirs that visit this place, and it's right next to the Pool of Bethesda, stand there and sing, and you can actually sing harmony with yourself when you sing in that church. It's a beautiful place to sing.
In fact, I understand there is a stone wall on the outside of the door so that if sound comes out, it's actually bounces back in as part of this extended echo effect. I actually like, I don't sing, but if I could, I've heard people sing, and just stop. And then you have it, you just hear it going and going and going and going and going and going.
Yeah, it'll go for almost 10 seconds.
But you've talked about continuing to sing while the echo, so you can actually create these parts.
I save my voice till I get to that spot when I take a group there, and I sing a Gregorian chant in that church. And it's a chant that is about Christ, but it goes fast, and so you can actually harmonize with yourself in that building. It's the only room I've ever been able to do that in. So I sound really good in that room.
Well, it's a spectacular church in restoration. Familiar from postcards for people who have not been there. Familiar certainly for people who have visited Jerusalem. This is what?
This is the Dome of the Rock. So it's not Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is further to the south, but this is built over the location where most people feel the Jewish temple, the second temple, was located. This was built by, well, it was built in 691, I believe the date is. And with these beautiful glazed tiles. And it's famous for the tile work.
Do we have the Al-Aqsa Mosque off in the distance there? Are we looking to the south? We're looking a different direction. Right. Okay. And
this
then
is the third holiest site, right?
Yes.
In Islam, after Mecca and Medina.
Right. And this because of the departure of Muhammad on the mare, on his rise to...
And the building is just beautifully covered with calligraphy, and it's gorgeous.
And we have been told by authorities who know what this says. What do we have here? Reading, we don't have to read the Arabic. It's been pronounced to us very well, but it would read from the right to the left. Something about humans, and that this is for humans and for all humans, and that this is a very inclusive statement about God's care for all humans.
You can see it's kind of a typical Islamic arch from the Islamic period. And one of the ways you identify that architecture is the alternating red and white stones or the black and white stones. And this is a beautiful arch. This is one of the exits of the Temple Mount. And you can see the beautiful inlaid work at the top. And we've got a close-up on the right of the screen there. And it's just gorgeous. Of course, it has gone through some destructions for different people probably that have tried to destroy it. But nevertheless, it's a beautiful arch. And the architecture is world famous. Islamic architecture is world famous. And it's... we even copy it in Southern California.
Right. It's Mamluk, which is, they're interesting people. These were slaves.
They were.
Who came to power. They took control in Egypt and established then period and regional control.
It's my understanding that there's a large number of Islamic, really pristine Islamic buildings in Jerusalem. And if we had time, it would be really interesting to look at more of them.
And all over the Temple Mount. You could spend your life, I think, studying the art on the Temple Mount itself, the memorial tombs that are there that other people have built during the centuries, and the architecture is just stunning. There's a close-up of that one. You can see the alternating colors. Almost as though this was an earlier arch and a later arch was put on top of it, and it's more ornate up top than it is down below.
It's almost like a sunburst, isn't it?
It's just beautiful.
And Islamic art and architecture, typically without figures, without humans certainly, geometrical sorts of things, really setting the tone throughout the Mediterranean up into southern Europe for architecture.
Spain certainly influenced terribly by that.
Right.
And the whole pointed arch.
Oh yeah.
Came back with the Crusaders to Europe.
Yeah. And this is a Crusader Arch here. It's in the Jewish quarter of the city of Jerusalem, the old city. And it's now there are some very expensive stores in there, but it gives you a feeling of how they would cover some of these roadways. Perhaps even the Cardo may have been here, and it finally was covered by the Crusaders for protection as well as just the beauty of the arch.
For those who travel to the Middle East, this simply exudes souk, a marketplace, often covered. These major souks we wish still survive. I don't know what the situation is in Aleppo and in Damascus, but certainly other places in the Middle East. These terrific shopping areas of...
This looks really long, but it's not as long as it looks. It's foreshortened in a sense. One of the chapels in the Church of the Holy Sepulcher is called the Chapel of St Helena, and during the Crusade period, the Easter is celebrated by a 24-hour period in the chapel, and so Crusaders and people who traveled, pilgrims came. They would line these steps and have to spend all night there. And this is on the wall of that the staircase that goes down to the Chapel of St Helena, and which is Constantine's mother. And so you see thousands of these crosses. Leaving something of themselves as they prayed.
And Helena, the mother of Constantine, put that into context. Constantine, the Roman emperor, who, can we say, legalizes Christianity or raises Christianity to a legal status?
In 312, at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. The next year, the Edict of Milan in 313. Right. So then Christianity becomes legal. Helena was already a Christian. And so then she goes to the Middle East to identify these very important sites in the life of Jesus, this place of his birth, death.
There's a huge history of pilgrimage in the Middle East, and there are even journals of pilgrims you can read of their trips. Then sometimes they were tents, and they had to fight off robbers and people as they came. They really wanted to see the place where Jesus was buried, and the beauty of the pilgrimage is evidenced by some of these kinds of carvings on the sides. And I've often thought we'd try to count them, see how many there actually are. I had my students one time take about a 2-foot square and count them, and there are hundreds of them in those squares.
That was not the right one we wanted. Here we go. Okay.
Most of the walls that you see currently around Jerusalem now are Ottoman-built walls. This is a corner of a pillar that's called the Ottoman Tower, built on top of Hasmonean and Herodian stones. So we have there at the bottom some Herodian stones there with the bossing around the edge. You kind of pick out those Herodian stones. And then farther over you see some of the earlier ones from that towards the Hasmonean period. So the reuse of materials was continuing. We wouldn't have a walled city without the Ottomans having...
Right, most of what we call the Old City is really the time of Suleiman the Magnificent, 1500s.
You know, this wall provides, I think, an interesting example. It is a wall, it's a solid wall, but you can also read the different parts and the different components to it. And with care,
actually,
let me, some dating.
before you move, let me point out, there's about the only traces of the Old Testament period are a few tombs which are mostly quarried away in the bedrock here, so dating to the 8th and 7th centuries.
So we have a long span coming across this wall.
There's a good overview of Tower of David in that area, right? We just took that picture.
Right. I had an unusual experience being in Jordan, actually, on a sabbatical, on a research leave in 1999, 900 years after the First Crusade arrived in Jerusalem. And something was developing across the river. A group of Europeans decided they were going to follow the path of that First Crusade and arrive in Jerusalem in July of 1999 and commemorate that first trip. And by the time they got there, they had kind of gathered people along the way, about 500 people. And they came into the old city and had a proclamation. This was publicized well in advance, and they stood up as Christians and said, "We're here to apologize for the Crusades." That was moving. So we're talking about some kind of, at least a way of getting past the sorts of tensions that we all read about. We read about the tensions in the newspaper, but there's more to this when we think about stories like that.
The Christian Church used a lot of military imagery, which hasn't proved, I think, over the centuries to be particularly helpful. Crusades and campaigns and all of those things. And the people that had to receive those crusades and campaigns that gave those words other meanings. And those are the words, that's the memories that last.
Right. Well, we have a few minutes to look at some artifacts, and I'm going to start with you, Larry. You have some metal things there in front of you, some of them Roman, but certainly could be used long into later periods.
So here's a door knocker that would be on somebody's door, a ring in the lion's mouth. And here you have a little compact. That would be a cosmetic compact, maybe.
Actually, the hinge is still there, isn't it? Yeah.
That's right. In fact, I think that we can probably open it here so that you can see. This had a mirror, probably, and the powder. Then there's a little Roman safety pin. You can see the head of the pin here. And it's like the arm, and it would be used to keep a toga on. And then you mentioned the other metal objects for incense, presumably, and a little pitcher. So
now who would own these, or who would use them? If the one has to do with incense, probably functioning or being used in a worship setting, in a cultic setting.
Very possible, right.
But would this be the kind of thing that the people who are called the Am Ha'aretz, the people of the land, would they own that, or would this be more?
You know, usually these metal things would belong to somebody of means, right? The common people would have
be on the other side of the table.
Right, yeah. The ceramic things.
Really, you're standing in front of some Roman glass.
This wonderful Roman glass. This has been buried in the ground, and why it's such a beautiful color now. Probably perfume bottles, cosmetic bottles for eye makeup, and one for perfume, this tall one, beautiful perfume. So the glass, it's amazing to see it whole like this, having been dug up out of the ground. You often find a lot of flakes of glass in the ground when you dig in.
In fact, the colors that really draw us to these are mostly from deterioration, aren't they?
It's from the chemical soil. In fact, some glass scholars can identify where the glass was buried, where it was used, because of the color of the patina, because certain soils create certain colors of the patina.
And these still are undergoing curation.
Yes.
So it'll be some time. In fact, this is so fragile that we turn to experts to help us do this. And I think we've got some lamps, Kent.
Well, we do. We have, these would be everyday use lamps in the Byzantine period. Different motifs, usually Christian or generic decoration. This one actually has a symbol of Christianity, the Kiro symbol there. Perhaps a tree of life, a motif developed out of the menorah, the candlestick. This is a little bit later. This is Islamic period, probably early Islamic. You can see it's beginning to look a little bit like those medieval lamps that we associate with Aladdin, which are based on this style. But let me say something about the pilgrim flask. The Byzantine period is the age, par excellence of pilgrimage. We have the story of the Bordeaux pilgrim, the itineraries where he or she visited in 333, the Igaria in the 380s. And they would carry their water with a rope around the side here on the donkey, or usually by foot. And this is how they would, their canteen. We have everyday cooking pots from the Roman Byzantine period here. This is how everyday people would cook their meals. A lot of stews. Cut up the vegetables, the grain, and just cook it up.
And what, hang this over a fire?
Yeah, or nestle it on the coals. You can still see the soot.
The soot is very much evident here.
And the interesting about the pilgrim flask, there's a whole series of studies on pilgrim flasks like that. They're a great refrigerator because as the water evaporates, the water inside stays cold. So that in a hot day, that would be nice. I want Ken not to miss this large lamp.
We got
Go
a couple
ahead,
lamps here.
I don't want you. It looks like a chandelier.
Well, these with multiple wicks are usually ceremonial in some ways. This is 13 wick holes, and so that would be for very special occasions or religious contexts, right? You can imagine it would be much brighter. And we don't usually have nearly this many. There are double-wicked lamps, sometimes up to 5, but this is quite unusual.
What about this one on a stand?
Yeah, that's quite a unique one. And again, you can see how easy it is to carry this one around. Probably, again, religious ceremonies where you need to move with the lamp. Let me just say about the flask again.
Okay.
Speaking of the cooling effect of the porosity of the clay, in Jordan, where we dig, we'll be over there this summer, we use what's called an ibrik. And it's actually made with salt in the clay. The salt dissolves out. It increases the porosity, but the evaporation keeps the water cool.
Yeah, it does.
It really does. Okay, and did we miss anything here? These primarily domestic, everyday life sorts of things, moving this way, also domestic, typically everyday, but moving toward more the elite goods. I mean, who would have Roman glass?
Well, you think what's in them. These are expensive perfumes. Mary Magdalene, anointing Jesus, having to save a lot of money for something like that. So these would be, again, elites or very special occasions, maybe funerals, burials.
Well, I want to thank you, Kent and Bailey and Larry, and all of you for joining us for this edition of Excavating the Bible, What Archaeology Can Teach Us. We hope the program has added something for food for thought and food for the soul, and we look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep exploring, and keep believing. For Excavating the Bible, I'm Doug Clark.